Murder on Tyneside. Chapter 27. Once Alan and his sergeant had left, Agnes moved through to the drawing room. It was a lovely day outside. It would be nice to take a stroll along the quayside and finish off by sitting with a nice glass of wine outside the cafe close to the hotel. Yet, at the same time, she wanted to stay where she was and think everything through. She had been involved in this case since the beginning. She knew everything. The police did. Therefore, there was no reason why she couldn't piece the bits together herself. But where should she start? She knew nothing about what might have happened at the hotel before she arrived. But obviously it hadn't involved calling in the police. Alan would have told her. Therefore, she could only assume the whole chain of events, ending with finding herself locked in the attic, had begun with Mrs. Hargreaves's missing necklace. Had Mrs. Hargreaves's room been particularly chosen that day? Or had the thief simply been lucky? Moving on to the theft of the necklace stolen in London, MI5 seemed to believe it had been brought to this hotel. Why this hotel? Was it because of its closeness to the open sea? But then many other hotels were situated close to rivers leading down to the sea, and some were far nearer to London than Newcastle. However, she decided not to go down the road of trying to decide why they had chosen the Millennium Hotel as their dumping base. The fact was they had. For the moment, she decided to focus on what she did know, and that led her straight back to the thefts at the hotel. Now she was going around in circles, yet she was determined not to give up. She beckoned a passing waiter and ordered a large, strong black coffee. That was exactly what she needed right now. It would keep her alert. While placing her order, she casually mentioned Ahmed's name. "I'm sorry, madam, but Ahmed won't be on duty until 5 o'clock this evening." "No problem at all, Paul," she said, peering at the name pinned on his shirt. "I agree. Everyone needs time off to unwind." At least she wouldn't have to watch what she ate or drank before he came on duty. After that, she would eat out. There was no way she wanted to meet him again. She thought back to the matter in hand. Could it be possible that the thief stealing the necklaces from the rooms of this hotel was part of the gang that stole the valuable necklace in London? She wasn't sure where that little spark of inspiration came from. Her strong coffee hadn't even arrived yet. Nevertheless, it was worth more thought. Was it conceivable that whoever was stealing the necklaces from guests staying at the hotel was simply doing so to distract attention from the theft of a really valuable piece being removed at a later date? The waiter set her coffee down on the table in front of her. She signed the bill and, reaching into her handbag, she gave him a large tip. "Thank you," she said, smiling up at him. "No, madam. Thank you," he replied. Agnes took a sip of her coffee as thoughts continued to flutter through her mind. Alan had told her how Mr. Anderson had almost blown his stack when he reported the robbery of his wife's necklace. But then who wouldn't, if something expensive had been stolen from a hotel room? But the chief inspector had grave doubts about whether the Andersons were telling the truth. She recalled the picture of the necklace, which Alan had shown her. "Look at how it is being presented, Agnes," he had said, stabbing his finger on the picture. "It is standing alone. Other jewelry on display is set well back from this one piece." He was right. Most jeweler's shop windows didn't have space for such an arrangement. Even displays inside the shops weren't so elaborate. Therefore, the piece Mr. Anderson was claiming to have belonged to his wife could be the valuable necklace stolen in London. It must have been on show somewhere in the world for him to have a photograph of it. If so, the police needed to find out where. Then they could trace Anderson's movements and find out whether he took the photo himself or if it had been given to him by whoever he might be working for. But why would the Andersons draw attention to the necklace if it didn't belong to them in the first place? What did they expect to gain? Did they think the police would believe they had been robbed, which would allow them to claim for insurance? Yet surely the insurance company would have seen Mrs. Anderson's piece of jewelry before agreeing to insure it. Consequently, they would know whether or not the piece in the photo was the same as the one on their files. She sighed. She was getting nowhere, and to make things worse, she was beginning to get a headache. Perhaps it would help clear her head if she were to take a walk in the sunshine. Murder on Tyneside. Chapter 28. Chief Inspector Johnson had instructed plainclothed officers to watch Ahmed, the waiter. Men were stationed a short distance from his flat and were to follow him wherever he went. Alan had made it clear he didn't want him picked up until they had absolute evidence that he was responsible for kidnapping Agnes. He certainly didn't want the man to get off on some technicality. After the meeting had broken up in the early hours of the morning, he and Sergeant Andrews had agreed that Ahmed should not be arrested or questioned. About Agnes. Before they had left the hotel, Drummond had made it clear that if the waiter was involved with the theft of the necklace in London, it was important to let him believe he had got away with it. It would be foolhardy to arrest him now. Besides, he didn't have anything to do with Mrs. Lockwood's kidnapping, he had said. Nevertheless, when Alan said he understood the reasoning behind the suggestion, it was clear in his own mind that if Ahmed became the slightest threat to Agnes, he would arrest the wretched man himself. Alan was also aware that the officers who had hung around in the storeroom, in the hope of catching the kidnapper, had arrived back at the station empty-handed. The first person to enter the storeroom was the storekeeper's young assistant, and he had nearly jumped out of his skin when the officers pounced on him. It was evident that either the culprit already knew Agnes had escaped and the police were on the scene, or he hadn't planned to go back at all, leaving it for the day staff to find her. Maybe he was teaching her a lesson for getting involved in the first place. Where do we go from here? Sergeant Andrews scattered his paperwork across his desk. This case is getting more ridiculous by the hour. He shook his head. How are we supposed to write up the case when all we have are questions and no answers? He shook his head. Let's face it, we haven't a clue about what is really going on. Alan empathized with his sergeant. Most cases they had worked on, there had been at least one clue they could ponder over. From there, they had gone on to solve the case together. There was no doubt they were missing something. He leaned back in his chair and clasped his hands behind his head. What the hell were they missing? David Drummond watched the two men as they stepped into the hotel. His eyes followed them as they strode across to the reception desk to check in. These were the two agents sent to escort him back to London. Once they caught up with him, all he had worked for would be lost. His replacement was probably already on their way to Newcastle with full instructions to find the missing necklace at all costs. He had to keep out of their way until he finished what he had set out to do. The annoying thing was, everything had been going so well until someone had taken that damn photo. From then on, he had messed up big time. He watched the men sign for the key cards before making their way across to the lift. They already had his room number, so he guessed once they dropped off their cases they would head for his room. But he wouldn't be there. He had also switched off his mobile phone, so they couldn't contact him that way. He still had a little time left to play the winning hand, so long as nothing else got in the way. He hadn't checked out of the hotel. That would have been too obvious. But he had filled his briefcase with essential items of clothing in the hope he might find somewhere nearby to stay for the night. One more day and he would be home and free. It was then that he saw Agnes walking across the reception towards the hotel entrance. It was obvious she hadn't seen him, and he wanted to keep it that way until the two agents were in the lift. Once the lift doors had closed and it had started to move, he picked up his briefcase and hurried out onto the quayside. Agnes wasn't too far ahead, and he quickly caught up with her. Weren't you meeting up with your replacements today? She was rather surprised to see him suddenly appear at her side. I decided to keep out of their way for a while. I'm not keen on letting go of this case yet. David looked over his shoulder towards the hotel as though expecting to see one of the agents watching them. Can we have a drink or something somewhere? I don't want them to see me. Agnes pointed towards the cafe she had often used over the last week. We could go there. I usually sit outside and people watch, but I'm sure we could find a secluded table somewhere inside. It gets rather busy, so I don't think anyone will take any notice of us. A few minutes later, they were seated in the cafe. David had already been to the bar and ordered a bottle of wine and 2 glasses. It's a bit early, but at least the sun is over the yardarm, he joked. So, what do you want to talk to me about? Agnes asked. I thought we had discussed everything earlier this morning while we were with the 2 detectives. Yes, I appreciate that. But he paused as the waiter brought the wine to the table and opened the bottle. But? Agnes queried, once the waiter was out of earshot. There was no way she was going to allow him to wriggle out of what he had been about to say due to the brief interruption. More might have been said the previous evening if it hadn't been for her being drugged and kidnapped. Even now she was free, she shivered at the thought of how it could have ended. But I'm afraid I haven't been quite so honest with you, or the police. Agnes took a sip of her wine before saying anything. She wanted to give him Time to follow up on his statement, but he didn't add anything further. So, what are you telling us? Agnes ventured. She spoke quietly, not wanting to sound threatening. Yet she wanted to know what was going on. It was obvious David had wanted to talk to her about something. It was he who had caught up with her and suggested this rendezvous. Therefore, why was he still being so cagey? Or was it an act? She wasn't sure where that last thought had come from. Drummond took a large gulp of wine before he spoke. I don't believe the thefts at the hotel have anything to do with the necklace stolen in London. He glanced towards the door for a second before continuing. From what I can gather, since the police picked up the scent of the theft in London, they seem to think there might be a connection between the two. But I maintain they are totally unconnected. What makes you think that? Agnes asked. Her mind was racing back over the last few days. It was when the Andersons reported the theft of their necklace, and Alan had seen the photograph in their possession that he had suspected there might be a connection. He had wondered whether the hotel thefts had been set up to draw attention away from the big haul in London, especially since learning that the priceless necklace had found its way to Newcastle. I was watching George Hargreaves when his wife's necklace was stolen. David interrupted her thoughts. He didn't seem remotely concerned about the theft. He even tried to stop his wife from contacting the police, but she did call them, and he kept well away from the investigation. Why? So what are you saying? I don't know yet, but there has to be a reason why he was so against calling the police. Agnes took a sip of her wine to give her a moment to collect her thoughts. Yes, she agreed George Hargreaves had tried to calm his wife down by telling her she had simply mislaid the necklace and was making a fuss about nothing. She had heard them both arguing outside her room on the evening in question. Don't you think he was acting rather strange for a man whose wife's necklace had been stolen? David continued. Think about it, Agnes. Would your husband have acted so casual if a necklace he had given you for a present had been stolen from a hotel room while on holiday? For a moment, Agnes wanted to reach across the table and punch David on his nose. How dare he bring him into this conversation? But then she realized what he said was true. There was no way her husband would have dismissed her claims so casually. Even if he hadn't bought the piece of jewelry in question, he would have stuck by her side during the whole investigation. He would never have slunk off to the bar to get drunk and left her to deal with the police alone. David had a point. Agnes's eyes flashed from side to side as she thought about it. Why would Hargreaves want his wife to believe her necklace hadn't been stolen? Why didn't he want her to call the police? Surely any husband would want the theft of his wife's jewelry to be investigated, especially if it was as expensive as Mrs. Hargreaves claimed. She clicked her fingers as the penny dropped. He took it himself, she said, triumphantly. He took it and tried to have her believe she had mislaid it. But his wife wasn't having any of that and demanded the police should be called in. Why would he do that? David asked. Yes, I can see where you are coming from, but why? Perhaps he needed the money, she replied. Maybe he sold it to pay off some gambling debts. Or it could be that his business, if he has one, isn't doing too well at the moment. She hesitated as another thought ran through her mind. However, once the police were involved, George might have panicked, fearing he could be found out. Therefore, that's when he decided to make it more convincing by stealing jewelry from other guests. You know, I think you might be onto something there. Drummond stroked his chin as he stared at Agnes. But that's not all. Her eyes were gleaming with excitement as she continued. I still don't know for certain whether the Andersons are involved with the necklace stolen in London. However, assuming they are involved and they had it hidden in their room waiting for someone to collect it, then it could have been George who took it. He probably had no idea how much it was worth when he stole it. Well, George is in for a nasty surprise when he tries to sell it. David replied. I'll have to try to catch up with him and have a quiet word. If he is the thief at the hotel and he took the necklace from the Andersons' room, I can only hope he still has it. And I'll have to have a word with the chief inspector. But before we part company, can I ask how your family fits into all this? Agnes paused. Okay, George may have stolen the jewelry, but I really can't see him as a murderer. Nor do I believe he had anything to do with me being kidnapped. So why were they targeted and by whom? I disagree with you on that. People do many things to cover up a crime. Some even commit murder. He shrugged. Who would have thought of George as a thief? But now you think he stole his wife's necklace and then a few others. To put the police off the scent. Anyway, I don't want you to get involved. But I am already involved, Agnes insisted. I was at the scene when both bodies were found. I was drugged and stuck upstairs in the storeroom at the hotel. And previous to that, you were following me around as you suspected I had taken a photo of you leaving the scene of where one of your siblings was killed. Surely, I couldn't be any more involved. She looked around, hoping no one had heard her last statement, but everyone seemed to be too preoccupied with their own conversations. Please, just leave it. Let me sort it out. I haven't got much time. I can't evade my replacements for much longer. He sighed. I really need to find somewhere else to stay for tonight. I can't stay in my own room as they will know my room number. It needs to be close by. You can stay in my room if you can get up there without being seen. Agnes interrupted. You'll have to sleep on the sofa, which I know isn't too comfortable, but at least you will still be in the same hotel. I don't like to impose. What about your reputation? If no one is to know you are there, then my reputation will be intact. Then I would be grateful to take you up on your offer. I can't see me getting away with it for more than 24 hours, so the closer I am to the scene of the events, the better. Good. Now that's sorted, you will be able to fill me in on all the details tonight. She had a sudden thought. You don't snore, do you? Murder on Tyneside. Chapter 29. Once David had left the cafe, Agnes pulled out her mobile phone to call Alan. David had urged her to wait until he'd had a chance to speak to George Hargreaves first, but she had disagreed, telling him that the police had a right to know her thoughts on the matter. Once Alan answered her call, she told him about her meeting with David and then went on to say who she thought might be the thief and the reasoning behind her idea. David has gone off to try to find George right now. He's keen to know whether George has the necklace stolen from the Andersons' room. I gather that the two agents replacing him have arrived at the hotel. So far, he has managed to avoid them. He is determined to solve the case he was sent here to investigate before they take over. Did that make sense? Agnes knew she was gabbling, but she wanted to get her message over as quickly as possible. Yes, I understand what you're saying. Alan was furious with himself. Why hadn't he thought that George Hargreaves might have had an ulterior motive for his reluctance to get involved in the theft? He threw a paperclip at Andrews to get his attention and then nodded towards the extension phone on his sergeant's desk, suggesting he should listen in. So you think George Hargreaves stole his wife's necklace because he was in debt, said Alan, hoping his sergeant would be able to pick up on the conversation. Yes, didn't I just say that? Agnes removed the phone from her ear and stared at it for a moment. Sorry, Agnes, I just wanted my sergeant to catch up with the conversation. Fine, said Agnes. Anyway, Drummond agrees with me, and like I said, he has gone off to find George. So what is Drummond doing about his replacements? No doubt they have his room number and will be waiting for him. Yes, that's what David is afraid of. That's why I said he could spend the night on the sofa in my room. Once the conversation had ended, Agnes sat back in her seat to finish her wine. Alan hadn't sounded too pleased about David spending the night in her room, but he hadn't made a big fuss about it. How could he? It wasn't really any of his business. However, what he had said had made a great deal of sense and had left her wondering whether she had done the right thing. Alan was concerned that as David's siblings had both been murdered, it was possible the killer might now be watching David. He could well be the next target. Agnes swallowed hard. Alan could be right. If that was the case, she would be putting herself in the line of fire. She looked at the bottle on the table. There was still a little wine left in there. With a sigh, she swiftly refilled her glass and took a large gulp. She had been too hasty with the invitation. She knew that now, yet she had simply wanted to help David out of a jam. But since her conversation with the chief inspector, something else was starting to niggle away at the back of her mind. David hadn't answered her question about how his family became so involved with the case that they were murdered. He had skipped over that one pretty quickly, suggesting he didn't want her any further involved. But if that was the case, why had he agreed to spend the night in her room? Surely that was involving her more than ever. Agnes took a sip of her wine. She was beginning to feel very uneasy about the night ahead. She decided to put it out of her mind by focusing on how to spend the rest of the day. However, for the first time since arriving in Newcastle, she felt at a loss as to what to do. Until now, her days had been filled with various aspects of the case, usually with Alan at her side, and she had felt quite excited about it all. But today it seemed she was being left out. Once she had spoken to Alan, he and his sergeant had rushed off to seek out George Hargreaves. No doubt they wanted to find him before Drummond caught up with him. They were probably all at the hotel now having a heated argument as to who should be the first to interrogate Hargreaves. She would have liked to have seen the fiasco, but after speaking to Alan, she wasn't keen to meet up with Drummond at the moment. Alan had suggested dinner that evening before hanging up, and she agreed. Therefore, she was going to wait until she had spoken to him before bumping into Drummond. Agnes finished her drink and left the cafe. She was just about to turn back towards the hotel when she saw George Hargreaves. Obviously, neither Drummond nor the police had caught up with him, as he seemed quite at ease, talking to a man near the Millennium Bridge. As she watched the two men in conversation, Agnes had a strange feeling that she had seen the man before, but as she couldn't place where that might have been, she dismissed the idea. She pulled out her phone to call Alan and let him know where George was, but on a sudden impulse, she decided to take a photograph of the two men talking together. It might be very useful at some point. There was no reply when Sergeant Andrews knocked on the door of George Hargreaves' room. He tried again, thumping the door hard with his fist and calling out, "Police, open the door." But there was still no response. I wonder whether Drummond has already caught up with him. Alan was thinking aloud. "We could try Drummond's room," said Andrews. "He might have taken Hargreaves there to interrogate him." Alan shook his head. "Drummond won't be there. He's lying low at the moment, trying to avoid the two agents sent to replace him." He quickly explained how the agent wanted a little more time in Newcastle to solve the case. Once he talks to his replacements, his orders are to return to London immediately. So has he moved out of the hotel? If so, does anyone know where he's gone? Andrews asked. Alan sighed. Mrs. Lockwood told him he could spend the night on the sofa in her room. What? Andrews yelled. And you're okay with that? No, I'm not okay with it. It's a bad idea. Alan retorted. He didn't usually raise his voice to anyone. In the army, he had been renowned for keeping a cool head under all circumstances. So why was he so on edge now? Was he so frustrated with this damn case he couldn't help himself? Or was there more to it than that? Had his feelings for Agnes totally mixed him up? No woman had had that effect on him before. He shook his head. But I can't tell her what to do. What the hell can I do about it? I have picked up on how you feel about Mrs. Lockwood, Andrews said slowly. But I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about whether you, me, the Newcastle police can really trust this man, Drummond. He took a deep breath and looked around. They were still standing in the corridor outside Hargreaves' room. Was this the best place to have this conversation? Can we go somewhere less conspicuous? Alan nodded. A few minutes later, they were downstairs in the manager's office. Mr. Jenkins had ushered them in, saying he was more than happy to allow the detectives the privacy of his room to discuss the case of the missing jewelry. Right. What do you want to tell me? Alan's tone was brusque. He hated being dictated to, especially by a subordinate. He could take it from his superiors. Well, he had to. That was part of the job. But spoken down to by his sergeant, that was something else. He watched Andrews look away for a moment, as though he was unsure of where to start. I know you had started to trust David Drummond, Andrews began. He held up his hand when Alan was about to interrupt. And, yes, after he explained himself, so did I to a certain extent. But I have spent a great deal of time thinking about this case, and I am beginning to wonder whether he is quite as legitimate as he makes out to be. Are you suggesting he is not with MI5? Alan asked. Because I can assure you he is. I checked it out a few days ago. It had taken him some time to get through the security protocol, but he had stuck with it and found David Drummond was indeed an agent with MI5. That did cross my mind at one point. But, no, I am wondering whether Drummond is an honest agent working for the good of the country, or rather, someone out there in the field looking out for himself. Andrews paused. I'm not saying his intentions weren't good in the beginning. He was probably a good agent, a good man, but people change, and not always for the better. I think Drummond changed for the worst over the years. The sergeant sighed. Look, I know you thought I was jealous, envious, or whatever of his position as an agent. And yes, I admit, I was slightly. But this is not about that, sir. This is about me. Coming up with the idea that this guy might be playing us from both sides. Once I had that notion fixed in my mind, I began to wonder whether he might have persuaded his superiors he was the best person to check out the missing necklace. Because of his connections in the north, he could have swayed them by saying how easy it would be for him to pose as someone visiting his family. Yet, all the time, he had been involved with the theft in London and wanted to be here too. Make sure he collected his share of the money. Sounds plausible, said Alan, thinking it through. But there's more. Andrews held up his hand. Don't you think it's strange that the very evening Mrs. Lockwood had dinner with him, she ended up drugged and locked in the storeroom? Again, Alan was about to interrupt, but Andrews got in first. I know. Mrs. Lockwood swears it was Ahmed she saw in her room just before she was struck on the head, but Drummond repudiates that. He insists Ahmed never left the bar area long enough for him to go up to her room and take her to the storeroom. Who do we believe? If I am right about Drummond, he and Ahmed could be working together, and if that is the case, then surely Drummond would vouch for him. He couldn't allow Ahmed to be arrested. He would realize that should the waiter confess everything for a deal with the law court, it would put him at the center of the theft in London. But it was Drummond who told us the waiter was an MI5 suspect in the first place, said Alan. Yes, that's true. Andrews agreed. But looking at it from another angle, might he simply have been trying to gain our confidence by giving us a name to be going on with? Isn't that what double agents do? Therefore, with that in mind, if we think back to the moment Ahmed came under suspicion for kidnapping Mrs. Lockwood, who leapt to his defense? None other than Drummond? Andrews answered his own question. He was adamant Ahmed couldn't have done it because he had sight of him all the time. I accepted that. We all accepted that, except Mrs. Lockwood. She never wavered. Even now, she is still convinced it was Ahmed who had entered her room that night. Andrews paused to allow his boss to say something, but Alan gestured he should carry on. Okay. Andrews continued. If what I have said so far is correct, then it's entirely possible that London have already come to the same conclusions. They could have been watching him for some time and now realize he is not all he makes out to be. This leads me to believe that the two so-called replacements are not here simply to take over the case, as he has us believe, but are really here to escort him back to London. It's also likely MI5 have already sent an undercover agent to carry on with the case. I would assume that the identity of this new agent will have been kept from Drummond and anyone else working on the case. The man or woman could already be at the hotel as we speak. They might even have been there for several days watching Drummond and trying to pick up the threads of what happened to the necklace after it arrived in Newcastle. Alan had listened intently and was impressed with his sergeant's conclusions, but at the same time he was annoyed he hadn't picked all this up himself. He was a darn good police officer. How could he have missed so much of what was staring him in the face all the time? Had he been so wrapped up with his childhood crush on Agnes he had let so many things slide past him? He had to admit, even she was coming up with answers to the case before he did. But there's something else. Andrews broke into Alan's thoughts. And this takes us back to the beginning of this conversation. What else could there be? Alan sighed heavily. As far as he could see, his sergeant had already summed it up. Assuming I'm right about Drummond, Andrews continued, then shouldn't we be more than a little concerned that he has managed to worm his way into spending the night in Mrs. Lockwood's room? Alan shot a glance at Andrews before reaching into his pocket for his phone. You're right. We have got to warn her, and we have got to find Drummond. Murder on Tyneside. Chapter 30. Agnes had just taken the photograph of George Hargreaves and the man he was talking to when her phone rang. Hello, Alan. I was just about to call you. Agnes, stop talking and listen to me. I will bring you up to speed when I see you. But in the meantime, whatever you do, don't allow Drummond into your room today, tonight, or any time. Stay away from him. My sergeant has a theory about him, and he could be right. Meanwhile, we are in the hotel and Hargreaves isn't here. We are going off to try to find both him and Drummond. That's what I was about to tell you. George Hargreaves is outside the hotel. As I speak, I can see him. He's right by the Millennium Bridge and he's talking to another man. Hurry before they move off. Okay, we're on our way. Alan didn't hesitate. He flipped his phone shut and swiftly made his way out of the office. Hargreaves is outside, he called out to his sergeant as he crossed the reception area and hurried towards the hotel entrance. A few minutes later, Alan and Andrews emerged from the hotel and saw Agnes standing across the street. When she spotted them, she pointed to where George and the other man were still deep in conversation. The chief inspector motioned Andrews to approach the two men from behind. "Good afternoon, Mr. Hargreaves," Alan said, once Andrews was in place. Chief Inspector," George mumbled. For a moment he looked a little taken aback, but he recovered quickly and glanced at the man standing beside him. "Chief Inspector Johnson is working on the case of my wife's missing jewelry," he explained. "I suppose he wants to bring me up to date." He looked back at Alan. "How is it going? Have you anything to report?" "That's what we would like to talk to you about," Alan replied. He turned towards the man George had been talking to. The man was clean-shaven and wearing a smart, navy blue suit. He wasn't tall, which meant he had to look up slightly to meet the inspector's gaze. However, he was heavily built and looked as though he spent several hours each week at the gym. "And you are?" Alan asked. "I'm just an old friend of George," he replied, hastily. "We play golf and often go to the races together. We just happened to bump into each other. If that's all, Chief Inspector, I'll leave you two to talk." The man nodded at George and would have moved away if Sergeant Andrews hadn't been blocking his path. "I think we should have a little chat at the police station." Alan took George by the arm. This man had run circles around him already. There was no way he was going to give him the slightest chance to run off and be lost in the crowds. "You can't do this. My wife is expecting me to join her for lunch shortly," George blustered. He looked at his friend. "James, you will have to meet her and explain what has happened." Alan glanced at his sergeant and shook his head. "I'm afraid your friend can't do that." "He's coming with us," said Andrews, taking the hint. He stepped alongside James and took his arm. "Don't worry, Mr. Hargreaves. Tell us where your wife is and we'll organize a policewoman to meet her and explain what has happened." Asterisk. Agnes watched the proceeding from the other side of the road. She hoped she was right about George Hargreaves. It would be awful if he was being arrested for something he didn't do. Yet the more she thought about it, the more convinced she was that it was he who had taken his wife's necklace. She traced her thoughts back to when she had seen him in the city center. At the time, she had put his look of sheer frustration down to the way his wife had spoken to him before she stormed off into the jeweler's shop. But today, when she was rethinking things through in the cafe with David Drummond, she had hit on the idea that he might have been angry because his wife was going to spend more money and put him into further trouble. It was at that moment she caught sight of Drummond. He was partly secluded because he was hovering in a shop doorway a few yards from where she was standing. Nevertheless, she could see he was looking very angry about something, most likely because the police had caught up with Hargreaves before he'd had a chance to talk to him. Not wanting him to see her, Agnes swiftly took a couple of steps backwards and ducked behind a parked lorry. When she saw him striding off down the road, she emerged from her hiding place and started to walk back to the hotel. But on a sudden impulse, she turned around and began to follow Drummond. Murder on Tyneside. Chapter 31. What is this all about? Why am I here? George Hargreaves demanded once they were at the police station. Have I been arrested? If so, then I want to see a solicitor. I know my rights. I think you know what this is about, Mr. Hargreaves, Alan replied, calmly. He had decided to question Hargreaves, while his sergeant had a word with James. I don't know what you are talking about. I'm talking about your wife's missing necklace. The chief inspector leaned across the table. Where is it? How do I know? Hargreaves replied. You know it was stolen. It's probably been passed onto some fence or whatever it is you call them. It could be anywhere by now. Alan watched as Hargreaves took out a handkerchief and mopped his brow. I think you know, because I believe you stole it in the first place. No, that wasn't me. I believe it was you. Then you tried to throw the scent off yourself by stealing a few more items from the other guests at the hotel. Alan sat back in his chair and watched Hargreaves fiddle with his handkerchief. For a moment, Alan felt sorry for him. It was obvious George had never been in trouble with the law before. This was definitely a first for him. Nevertheless, he was a thief and he would have to pay the price. Then we come to the 2 murders, Alan said, slowly. Now I'm beginning to wonder whether you might be our killer. For instance, the victims could have found out you were the thief and were going to inform the police. But you killed them both before they had the chance. Alan didn't really believe Hargreaves was the murderer. He was simply using the notion to lever him into confessing to the thefts. After all, the murdered woman was a guest at the hotel, he continued. And, as it turns out, the murdered man was her brother. If she had seen you, she might have passed the information to her brother, and then you would have had to kill them both? No, I didn't murder anyone. Hargreaves wailed. It sounds very plausible to me, Alan shrugged. And it means that we have solved both cases with one shot. No. You have got it wrong, George exclaimed. Which part? Alan asked. Hargreaves looked away for a moment. He had never meant it to come to this. All he wanted was a little money to pay off a gambling debt. Then he'd had the idea of stealing his wife's necklace and selling it. The money from the sale, together with the insurance for the stolen necklace, meant he would have been home and dry. But when his wife created such a fuss and called the police, he had panicked, terrified he would be the suspect. He had then decided to steal one more necklace in an effort to make the police look elsewhere. It had been so easy. Why not do it one more time? He knew now he should have quit while he was ahead. It was during the last theft that a man caught him leaving the room. He still didn't know how the man knew it wasn't his own room he was leaving. He had approached him and said he knew someone who would pay well for the jewelry and was willing to pass on the information, but there was a price. Okay, I'll confess I took the jewelry, Hargreaves said at last. He swallowed hard. But I swear on my children's life, I didn't kill anyone. No one saw me leaving the rooms. No one threatened to expose me. I am not your killer. By now he was sobbing. His mention of his children had made him realize he had let them down. What had he been thinking? Why had he allowed himself to be drawn into the gambling ring in the first place? But he knew why. He had thought he could win. And, yes, he had won a few times and the feeling had been good. Yet he had never won as much money as he had lost. Now he had lost everything. What would his family think of him? I never ever thought it would come to this, Hargreaves uttered. I simply wanted to pay off my debt and get the man off my back. He was going to ask my wife for the money. I couldn't let him do that. I didn't want her to know. I swore that once the money was paid, I would never gamble again. You have to believe me. What about the necklace you stole from Mr. and Mrs. Anderson's room? Alan asked. Hargreaves sighed. I sold it to the same man who bought the others. Would that be James, the man you were talking to earlier? Alan asked. No, Hargreaves shook his head. I was paying him. He works for the man I owe the money to. He looked away for a moment before turning back to face the chief inspector. It would have all been over today. Once I paid him what I owed, there would have been a little left over. I could have gone home with my wife at the weekend a happy man. But now, if you hadn't stolen from the other guests, I'm sure your wife would have dropped all charges and you would have been free to go, said Alan. But as it is, I am going to have to arrest you for multiple thefts at the hotel. I doubt the other people you stole from will be willing to drop the charges. He paused. I will leave the murder charge for the time being. But right now you can help yourself by telling me how we might contact the man you sold the jewelry to. In another room at the police station, Sergeant Andrews had just finished questioning James. It turned out his name was James Hitchens. He admitted that he wasn't really a friend of Hargreaves. In fact, he had never met the man until that day. He had simply been sent to Newcastle to catch up with Hargreaves, collect the money owing to his boss, and return to London. Why send you all the way up here? Andrews had asked. Surely, Hargreaves would have returned to London once their stay was over. However, Hitchens had merely shrugged, saying his boss must have had a reason and he hadn't asked. I don't ask questions. I simply do as my boss instructs. Then I get paid. When the sergeant had asked him to hand over the money he had obtained from Hargreaves, he had been reluctant to part with it, saying the money belonged to his boss now. But Sergeant Andrews had argued that the money had been illegally gained, and not wanting to be held at the police station any longer than necessary, he had complied. No doubt his boss wouldn't want to become embroiled with the Newcastle police. However, Hitchens refused to give the name of his boss when Andrews asked. There is absolutely no need to bring my boss into this. He is not involved with whatever Hargreaves did here in Newcastle, and neither am I. Therefore, if you are quite finished, I would like to leave. Andrews knew he didn't have any reason to keep Hitchens at the station. Yet, he was loath to let him go without learning what Hargreaves had told the chief. Inspector, I'm sure you would, but I need you to wait here until I find out what Hargreaves has had to say. Without another word, he opened the door and instructed the uniformed officer waiting outside to go in and stand guard until he returned. Down the corridor, Andrews entered a side room and peered through the one-way glass window. The chief inspector was still talking to Hargreaves. He switched on the speaker and heard Alan asking the name of the man who had bought the stolen jewelry. Obviously, Hargreaves had confessed to being the thief. Without any hesitation, Hargreaves gave a name and phone number. How did you come to hear about this, Mr. O'Donnell? Alan asked. Did you know of him before you arrived at the hotel, or, he paused for effect, did someone suggest to you that this man might be interested in buying the jewelry you had stolen? If that is the case, then I need to know the name of this other person and how he became aware you had stolen jewelry to sell. A few minutes ago, you told me that no one had seen you leaving the rooms with the missing necklaces. Andrews watched Hargreaves as he held up his hands in terror. Okay. One person saw me leaving a room. It was the day I stole the first piece after my wife discovered her necklace had gone missing. Like I said, I wanted to throw the police away from me. I saw an open door and found it easy to creep inside. While the lady cleaned the bathroom, I hid until she left and then had ample time to look around the room. At the time, I had no idea how I was going to sell my wife's necklace, let alone the second one. In the beginning, I had hoped that my creditor would take my wife's necklace as payment of my debt. But then this man appeared as I was making my escape. He didn't threaten to go to the police. Instead, he said he knew someone who would be happy to pay me for the jewelry I had taken. Hargreaves paused and loosened his tie. The chief inspector motioned for the uniformed officer at the door to ask for a glass of water for the suspect. Go on, said Alan after Hargreaves had drunk some of the water. I asked what I had to do to get the name of this person, George continued. I thought he was going to want half of whatever I got, but he didn't ask for that. The price was that I would need to rob a few more rooms, whichever I liked. I could keep whatever money I received from this man, but the last theft had to be the room number he would give me in due course. I would receive a payment as usual and then walk away. And if you didn't agree to his proposal, Alan prompted, did he threaten you in any way? He said he would meet up with my wife in a dark corner and Hargreaves broke off. I couldn't let that happen. What was the name of this person? Alan was trying to keep his patience. I don't know, Hargreaves uttered. He wouldn't tell me. He placed his head in his hands. Believe me, I didn't want all this. I love Angela. I love my family. I never wanted them to be involved in my stupidity. He looked up. Suddenly, I don't know his name, but I've seen him around the hotel a few times. Since he approached me, he doesn't acknowledge me, or I am. He's always alone, so I was surprised to see him with another guest the other evening day. Woman. I only hope he hasn't got his claws into her. This woman, said Alan. Do you know her name? No, Hargreaves replied, thoughtfully. But you must know her. I've seen you talking to her a couple of times. Alan leapt to his feet. Do you mean Mrs. Lockwood? Yes, that's her name, said Hargreaves. I remember now. Lockwood, there, was a film star by that name many years ago. Andrews was still listening in the next room. He gasped when he heard Hargreaves's last remark. Could the man who made Hargreaves steal the necklace from the Andersons be David Drummond? He saw the chief inspector make a dive for the door and hurried out into the corridor to meet up with him. I heard the tail end of that, said Andrews. Drummond really is behind all this. The chief inspector was only half listening. He had already pulled out his phone and was entering Agnes's number. I'm calling Agnes. She mustn't go anywhere near that man. He held the phone to his ear and waited for her to answer. A few moments later, he snapped his phone shut. There's no reply. I'm going to the hotel. It could be that her phone is on charge, said Andrews. Why not trying ringing her room at the hotel? Alan nodded. Picking up the nearest phone, he asked to be put through to the Millennium Hotel. The moment he was connected, he asked for Agnes's room. But again, there was no reply. She could still be somewhere in the hotel, said Sergeant Andrews. Yes, but I need to be sure. I've got a bad feeling about all this." Alan called out for one of the officers to stay with Hargreaves. Take his details and then lock him up. If he asks for a solicitor, get him one. "What should I do about James Hitchens?" Andrews asked. "He's handed over the money he received from Hargreaves, but he won't give the name of the men who sent him here. Tell the officer with him to get all his details, where he's staying, etc., and then let him go. But he's not to leave the area. Then come with me to the hotel." Murder on Tyneside. Chapter 32. Agnes kept a good distance between herself and David Drummond as she followed him along the quayside. If he paused for any reason, she stopped and looked in a shop window until he moved off again. One time, while waiting for him to move on, she had asked herself why she was doing this. He could simply be taking a stroll to work off the frustration of seeing the chief inspector catch up with Hargreaves before he did. Maybe he was simply going to call in to see his cousin in the restaurant. There were probably lots of reasons why he was ambling along the road. After all, where else did he have to go? If he went back to the hotel, he would very likely run into his two replacements. Therefore, given all that, why was she still following him? Nevertheless, here she was, trailing him along the road towards the Tyne Bridge. Once he reached the foot of one of the towers supporting the Tyne Bridge, he suddenly disappeared out of sight. Blast, she thought, as she moved towards where she had last seen him. Where had he gone? She started to walk slowly around the tower when someone grabbed her arm. She tried to call out for help, but before she could utter a sound, she was dragged into the base of the tower and the door was slammed shut. It was cold chill inside the tower and there was a musty smell of dampness. The lift that had once carried people from the quayside up to the bridge had gone, leaving only the empty shaft. "What are you doing?" Agnes cried out as she swung around and came face to face with David Drummond. "I could ask you the same question," he replied, smugly. "After all, you are the one following me." Agnes was about to deny it, but then she realized he must have seen her at some point. Okay, she rubbed her arm where he had grabbed her. "It was quite painful. Sorry about that. It's just that I had nothing going on this afternoon and when I saw you, look," she spread out her hands and changed her approach. All she wanted was to get out of here. This hadn't been a wise move. "I've said, I'm sorry, can I go now?" "I don't think so." Drummond held out his hand in front of him and inspected his fingernails. "Once you get out of here, you'll look for the kindly chief inspector, the man who has been drooling over you since you met up in the hotel the night George took his dear wife's necklace to pay off his mounting debts." Agnes's eyes widened. "You already knew George had taken his wife's necklace?" She narrowed her eyes. "Then why did you come to me earlier today? Seeking help?" "Don't flatter yourself, Agnes," he snarled. "I didn't come to you looking for help. For goodness sake, I do this for a living. I simply came to find out what you already knew. Or, with some prompting from me, what you might surmise if given a little information to work on." Agnes swallowed hard. She knew now that Alan had been right all the time. She should have stayed well away from his case and she should certainly have heeded his warning about Drummond. Yet she had enjoyed being involved with the investigation. And, as for his warning, well, it was definitely too late to back out now. However, if she was to get out of this alive, she needed to play for time. Her mind was racing. Alan was going to meet her at the hotel for dinner, though that wouldn't be for another few hours. But then another thought crossed her mind. The door to the tower had been locked the last time she had tried opening it. At the time, she had been curious as to whether there was still a lift from the quayside to the road above. However, after a couple of inquiries at the hotel, she had learned the door to the tower was permanently locked now. The hotel staff had gone on to tell her that the doors were only open 3 or 4 times a year when the building was being checked over. But once the man was inside, he was supposed to lock it after him, as it was likely he would be using the door on the bridge to walk along to the next tower. It had sounded complicated, but she had got their drift. Well, sort of. So, somewhere in all that speculation, did it mean that if Drummond had been able to gain access today, was there someone checking the tower and had they forgotten to lock the door? Was that person still somewhere above at this moment? But, more importantly, would they hear what was being said, get suspicious, and ring the police? "Hang on a minute," she said, raising her voice in the hope someone was up there. At that moment she felt her phone vibrate in her pocket. She had turned it off while she was in the cafe and had forgotten to switch it back on. She hoped Drummond hadn't heard it. If he had, he would take it from her and destroy it. While she still had a phone in her pocket, she felt there was hope. Earlier you said the chief inspector was drooling over me, she continued. Is that really true? Have I missed something? Alan really likes me? She giggled, trying to make it sound as though she didn't know about Alan's feeling towards her, though she had picked up on a few signs during the evenings they had spent together. That is so interesting. I should have paid more attention. I just thought he was being polite. You know he likes you. Stop fooling me around. I could kill you with one shot. He pulled a gun from his pocket. Then why haven't you? Agnes drew herself up to her full height, hoping to look more confident than she felt. Why did you drag me in here, if not to kill me? You could have killed me the moment you pulled me into this tower and walked out without anyone seeing you. She looked around the small space. The walls are so thick no one would hear a gunshot, except, maybe, the birds. It was true. The towers were filled with kittiwakes. They had made the place their home over the years. Yet you haven't pulled the trigger. Why? Drummond held the gun to her forehead. Before I kill you, I need you to understand why I went off the rails, as they like to call it these days. I want you to know what my life has been like since I left Newcastle to train to be an agent. Yes, I got my dream job, a job I had always wanted. I worked damned hard to get out there in the field, but I found it wasn't anything like I imagined. By that, do you mean it was nothing like the James Bond films you used to admire? Agnes said, did you think you would be sent overseas on a mission to save the world? I see my cousin has been talking too much. His grin was sinister, but in answer to your question, if you had a dream, wouldn't you have been disappointed if it hadn't worked out? I wanted people to know who I was and why I was there. I wanted to be appreciated, admired. But Drummond paused momentarily. He lowered the gun as he reflected on the past. Agnes took those few seconds to glance around the floor, hoping to see something she could grab to defend herself. She was disappointed there wasn't anything except the piles of dust which had been blown under the door due to high winds and the massive bird droppings, all waiting to be cleared away by whoever did the job. But, she prompted, she had to keep him talking. But nobody gave a damn, he yelled. Nobody knew who the hell I was. And why would they? I was undercover all the time. To them I was simply another Brit in a suit. I was there to look out for them, but they didn't know it, or if they did, they didn't give a damn. At first, I thought the pay would compensate for my disappointment, but it didn't. So I decided to turn things around. I devised a plan to use everything I had learned at MI5 to benefit me. So what did you do? I think you have already guessed what I did. Drummond pointed the gun at her again. Agnes had begun to put the pieces together, but if she was to get through this, she was going to have to keep him talking, even if it meant she had to listen to him crowing about how he pulled off the greatest robbery since the movie, The Italian Job. If I am about to die, then surely I am entitled to know how you stole the necklace from the museum. I'm sure it must have been very well guarded. You must have had an ingenious plan. She hated buttering up to this monster, but if it gave her a few more minutes, then she would keep up the small talk. I watched, listened, and learned, he replied. By doing that, I found a loophole in their security. They all sat back and drank a champagne toast once. They thought everything was in place. They said no one could possibly infiltrate the sanctuary they had created. He smiled. Yet I did. I did it. So where does Ahmed fit into all this? Agnes asked. She pointed towards the steps leading to the top of the tower. One of them wasn't quite as filthy as the others. Do you mind if I sit down? Drummond waved the gun towards the steps. Yes, sit down. He laughed. At least you won't have so far to fall when I pull the trigger. Agnes wanted to scream out at him, tell him he was insane, but that would only make him angry and more likely to pull the trigger there and then. Instead, she moved across to the steps and sat down. Now where were we? Drummond flapped the gun around as though it was a toy. Yes, Ahmed. He helped me put my plan into action. He helped me get the necklace out of the building in London. Now he's here in Newcastle too. Make sure nothing goes wrong. I paid him to come here and get a job at the hotel, so he would be nearby should I need him. Once I get the money for the necklace, I'll give him what we agreed and we will part company forever. But I will never forget him. He did well. What about the Andersons? Agnes asked. Where do they fit into all this? Drummond sighed. The Andersons were simply the carriers. They brought the necklace to Newcastle. No one would suspect them of having anything to do with the theft. They are just a married couple on a short trip to see the sights of this northern city. He paused. Anderson was meant to raise the alarm about the necklace being taken from his room, but he was not supposed to go overboard. It was just supposed to be another theft, plain and simple. Instead, he went into hysterics. When questioned by the police, Mr. Anderson produced a photograph to prove it was his, said Agnes. He wasn't meant to show the damn picture to anyone. Drummond hissed. I told him to take a photo of his wife wearing the necklace as proof it belonged to her, but he didn't. He damn well didn't. He almost spat out the words. If he had, the police would have accepted it and got on with the inquiry. Instead, the fool showed Chief Inspector Johnson the photo of the necklace in the massive display cabinet at the museum. Anyone with half a brain would have picked up on the true value of the necklace and worked out where the photo was taken. Why did you give him the photo in the first place? I mean, like you said, he could have taken one himself. Agnes spoke quietly and calmly. She had to keep him talking, but she couldn't afford to antagonize him any further. He was acting in a very volatile manner already. He didn't need any extra help from her. It was because he wanted something for a souvenir to remind him he had been at the heart of one of the biggest heists this country has ever seen. He said a photo on his camera wouldn't have convinced his friends he had been part of the theft. I insisted he must not bring the picture with him in case it was found. Once, I was out of the country in some safe haven and Ahmed was back to his homeland. Anderson could do what the hell he liked with it. He would be the one to take the consequences. Yet he brought it with him and then he showed it to a police detective. He shook his head. I couldn't believe it. For a moment he was silent. Then he glared at Agnes. And as if that wasn't bad enough, you decided to poke your nose in. Why did you choose this week to come to Newcastle? There was a sound from somewhere above and Agnes turned to look up the staircase. Drummond laughed. Don't get your hopes up. It's only the birds. This place has been empty for years. I doubt your Prince Charming detective is going to float down and whisk you off to safety. At the moment, he is probably interrogating George Hargreaves and whoever it was George was talking to. Agnes knew that to be true. Her only hope was whoever might be working further up in the tower might hear them. I'm sorry if my being here in Newcastle spoiled your plans, she said. It wasn't your being here that spoiled everything. It was your inquisitive mind. You could have stayed in the background like any normal person on holiday, but instead, you insisted on accompanying the detective wherever he went, especially after the pair of you found my bloody sister's body, he snarled. Then you set about figuring how the thief got into the rooms and again, today at the cafe, working out who the thief was. I just happened to be with Alan when the body was found, said Agnes. Hotly, I certainly didn't go out that night with the intention of finding someone lying dead on the pavement. She paused. I'm sorry. It's your sister you're talking about. We should show some respect. I do hope they find the murderer. Drummond shrugged his shoulders. Agnes was appalled at his attitude. Don't you care? Your sister and brother have both been murdered and all you can do is shrug. Why are you out there? Looking for the killer? The same person probably killed them both. Probably. He pulled a face and shrugged again. Go on. Think about it. He encouraged her. I'm sure you will get there in the end. Agnes leapt to her feet as the penny dropped. It was you, she yelled. You killed both your brother and your sister. How could you do such a terrible thing? Drummond laughed. It was easy. Look, I'll show you. Agnes closed her eyes as he lifted the gun to her forehead. Open your eyes. Don't you want to see how it's done? Murder on Tyneside. Chapter 33. Chief Inspector Johnson and his sergeant pulled up outside the hotel and hurried inside. In his mind, he knew he wasn't going to find Agnes there, but they had to start somewhere. No, she isn't in her room, said the receptionist, replacing the phone on its cradle. Could she be in one of the public rooms? She isn't in any of the rooms. Sergeant Andrews shook his head as he rejoined his boss. He had gone off to peer into the rooms on the ground floor, while Alan made inquiries at the desk. Perhaps she's just gone for a walk, he suggested. Then why didn't she answer her phone? The battery might have run out. It can't have. She told me she charges her phone every night. Maybe she forgot last night. Andrews ventured. No. Her phone rang, but she didn't answer and it went to voicemail. If it was dead, it would have gone straight to voicemail. Okay. Alan looked around the reception area as he had a thought. Where's Drummond? He turned back to the lady on the desk. Would you please try David Drummond's room? It was a long shot, knowing the agent was trying to keep away from the hotel. But he had to try all options. No reply, she said a few minutes later. He must have gone out. I didn't see him in any of the rooms, said Andrews. Alan turned away from the desk. He's most likely looking for Hargreaves. He thought for a moment. Unless he already knows we've got him. So you think he might have seen us escorting him and the man he was talking to back to the car? Alan nodded. And if he saw that happen, then he knew Agnes had spoken to us, telling us about what she suspected. This was getting ridiculous. Having a sudden thought, he suddenly swung around and spoke to the receptionist. Where is Ahmed? Ahmed, she asked. You mean the waiter who works in the bar? Yes. Where is he? I'll check, she said, picking up the phone. Alan turned back to his sergeant. If you're right and he is mixed up in this, then he has got to know something about Drummond that we don't. He'll be on duty in about 5 minutes, the receptionist said, glancing at the clock on the wall above her head. He wasn't due to be here until 5 this afternoon, but someone has called in sick, so... Right, we'll wait for him in the bar, Alan interrupted. But if you see him, before we do, don't make him aware we are waiting for him. This is police business. The receptionist nodded. In the bar, the two detectives chose a table at the back where they hoped they wouldn't be seen by anyone walking in the door. These damn mirrors might look very nice, but they aren't helping us at the moment. The chief inspector gestured towards the large ornate mirrors. Hopefully they won't give us away until it is too late. They didn't have to wait long before Ahmed strode through the door. He was whistling to himself as though he hadn't a care in the world. Alan waited until the waiter was well into the room before glancing at Andrews and nodding towards the door. He didn't want to give Ahmed a chance to make a run for it once he knew they were waiting for him. Good afternoon, said Alan. I'd like to have a word. Ahmed jumped at the sudden sound of the detective's voice. He swung around and would have made a run for the door if Andrews wasn't barring his path. How can I help you, Chief Inspector? Ahmed asked. You can start by telling me where David Drummond is. Who? Ahmed asked. You know who I mean. David Drummond, your partner in crime. Alan paused. He didn't have time for all this playing around. Before you carry on, denying you know the man, let me tell you that he has already told us about you. He told us it was part of his job to follow you here because you were suspected in the theft of a valuable necklace. He looked at his sergeant. However, Sergeant Andrews has a theory and I think he is onto something. He nodded towards Andrews. He believes you weren't working alone. He thinks Drummond was fully involved in the theft, that he probably masterminded the whole thing. But we also believe he will do anything to throw us off his scent, even if it means betraying you. I don't know what you were talking about. Ahmed was growing agitated. He waved his arms around. I came to England to make a new life for myself. When I saw they were advertising for a bar waiter here at this hotel, I applied for the job and I got it. I have worked hard. Ask anyone, ask the manager, he will tell you. Ahmed, you're not listening. Drummond has already given you up. He's looking out for himself. He is playing it from both sides. How else would we have known about you? Why are you still defending him? Alan gestured towards a chair. Sit down and think it through. Ahmed sunk into the chair and fell silent. Alan could tell he was weighing up his situation. Ahmed was probably trying to figure out how much Drummond had told them. I don't know where he is, Ahmed said at last. He wasn't going to take the fall for this man. That's the truth. He hesitated. However, whatever David might have told you, I want you to be clear about one thing. I did not kill those people. You mean Drummond's brother and sister? Alan asked. He glanced at his sergeant. He hadn't expected Ahmed to come out with something like that. They were his brother and sister? Ahmed leapt to his feet. Are you telling me that the two people he shot dead were members of his own family? Let's be clear on this. Are you telling us Drummond was the killer? Sergeant Andrews jumped in before Alan could open his mouth. It was David's cousin, Gordon Peterson, who told the chief inspector the two murdered people were Drummond's family. But you were saying it was Drummond who pulled the trigger. Ahmed flopped back into the chair. He killed them, he sobbed. I was with him when he did it. I told him at the very beginning I would help him steal the necklace from the museum. I would help him to get away. But I was adamant. I would not kill anyone. I am not a murderer. He brushed my concerns aside, saying murder would never be on the cards if we stuck to his plan. It was foolproof. He paused and cast his eyes down towards the floor. Yet two people picked up on what he was doing, or should I say, on what he had done. He covered his face with his hands. Alan looked across at his sergeant. This was all very helpful, but if Drummond was capable of killing his own family, then he was more than capable of killing Agnes. She had been a thorn in Drummond's side from the very beginning. He had to find her. But where did he start? Okay, I accept you don't know where Drummond is, Alan said. But is there anything you can tell me that will help me to find him before he kills someone else? You think he is going to kill again? Ahmed looked up sharply. I think he might, if someone gets in his way. You mean the woman? Ahmed sighed. You tell me, Alan shrugged, though he was seething inside. He had to get the truth from this man, even if it meant him sounding nonchalant. There was a woman staying at the hotel who was, he paused, thinking of the right words, getting under his skin. He thought she had something on him, but he didn't tell me more. He asked me to drop something in her drink to make her a little unstable. He swayed his hand back and forth as he spoke. He even gave me the little white pill. It was very small. Now he held his finger and thumb together to indicate the size of the pill. He told me to go into her room once the staff had left and take her up to the storeroom at the top of the hotel. I said it wouldn't be easy to get into her room, but he assured me I would figure it out. That was all I had to do. He would do the rest. So, what do you suppose the rest was? Andrews asked. Ahmed shrugged. I don't know, but it could have meant he was going to kill her. And you didn't have a problem with that? Alan snapped. Why should I? He had already killed 2 other people. Ahmed paused. But I didn't know they were his family. So it's all right to kill people as long as they aren't members of your family? Alan would have loved to punch this man in the face, but he held back. If Ahmed was to say he had been mistreated in any way, all his evidence would be dismissed as harassment by the police. No, that's not what I meant at all. I just told you. I said at the outset I wouldn't kill anyone. Yet you didn't object to being there at the murders or helping Drummond dispose of the bodies. Andrews said, as a matter of interest, what was the plan? To dispose of Mrs. Lockwood's body once Drummond had killed her. He wasn't going to kill her, as you would say. He was going to throw her off the roof. It would have looked like an accident. She was a nosy lady. She could have gone upstairs to see what was there and then accidentally fallen off the roof. So in your book, throwing someone off a roof with the intent to see them dead isn't murder? Tell me, what would the people of your country call it? Ahmed hung his head. Alan didn't wait for Ahmed to come up with an answer. His mind was fixed on Agnes. Where was she? Where was Drummond? From what Ahmed had told them, it appeared Agnes had said or done something which made Drummond realize she was onto him. This was probably why he had told Ahmed to drop something into her drink. Luckily, Agnes had come around and escaped before Drummond had time to get up there. Drummond had been very clever in not giving himself away later that evening when she had appeared unscathed from her ordeal. Even she had accepted he had nothing to do with her being drugged and hauled up to the attic. The only person she had seen in her room after the manager left was Ahmed. Therefore, what was Drummond up to now? What would be his next move? Obviously, he would want to keep a close eye on Agnes. He would need to know what she was thinking. He might even have considered contacting her in an effort to keep up with what she thought was going on. Was that why he had met up with her today? Agnes had told him about their meeting at the cafe when she called to tell him her thoughts on Hargreaves. Had he bumped into her accidentally to find out what she knew or even what she might come up with if given a few hints? Andrews opened his mouth to say something, but Alan held up his hand and sank into a chair opposite Ahmed. He was still thinking everything through. Was it possible Drummond was lurking around outside the hotel today when he and Andrews took Hargreaves into custody? Had he seen Agnes indicating to where George and James were talking? If she had foiled his plans to get to Hargreaves first, then might he be now taking his vengeance out on her? He closed his eyes. One thing was certain in his mind. He had to find her before it was too late. Take Ahmed back to the station, Alan said, leaping to his feet. I have got to find Mrs. Lockwood before anything happens to her. Andrews grabbed Alan's arm and dragged him away from Ahmed. Think about it, sir. Where are you going to start? He released Alan's arm. I know. You're worried, but you need to stay calm and focused. You can't do this alone. You need me with you, but we must have some other detectives scouring the quayside for both Mrs. Lockwood and Drummond. Get another officer here too. Escort Ahmed to the station and activate a search. But don't try to do this alone. Alan knew his sergeant was right. He was thinking with his heart rather than his head. Get onto the station and organize it. Tell them to get here as soon as possible. Once everything was in place, Alan and his sergeant hurried out of the hotel in search of Mrs. Lockwood. But where would they start looking?